Welcome to Beat Diabetes, and yes, once again, we're going to be looking at Rethinking Diabetes by Gary Taubes. We've been at it for quite some time now, looking through this book, and we've got maybe this session and maybe one more program to do before we move on to something else. But there's so much good stuff here by Gary Taubes. Once again, Gary is not a doctor, not even a nutritionist. He is a research journalist and has won a number of awards, a very keen thinker, and has come to decide and believe that a low-carb approach to diabetes is the very best method you can employ to put your diabetes into remission or reverse it or beat it or whatever term you want to use. He talks about, and we're going to get to some of the later studies. We've gone all the way back into the early studies and the early ideas and the early debates. And as I mentioned last time, those debates are still going on, but there's a lot stronger evidence these days in favor of a low-carb, higher-fat approach. So we're going to look at the idea of heart issues. Everybody recognizes that you're going to lower your blood sugar when you lower your carbs. I mean, that's a given. There's no argument. There's no debate. There's no controversy. Let me say it again. When you lower your carbohydrate intake significantly, you will lower your glucose levels. However, the issue arose when they came up with the idea of insulin. They discovered insulin, how to use it, how to prescribe it. They thought, well, we don't have to lower our carbohydrates. We can just give more insulin. And then they came up with meds. And so for type 2s, they said, well, you may not even have to take insulin. You can just take some high-powered meds, and you still don't have to lower your carbohydrates much. And they concluded that, well, the thing that you have to do is switch to the healthier carbohydrates, the whole grain carbohydrates, the fruit, the vegetables, whole grains, whole bread, brown rice, sweet potatoes. Just eat the healthier carbs, but you don't have to really cut back much on the carbs at all. And why did they say this? Why did they push this? There are several reasons. We talked about them last time, but one of the issues was it just seems so natural to eat carbohydrates. Everybody does it. So if we just switch you from white bread to brown bread, white rice to brown rice, white potatoes to sweet potatoes, you'll be good. But one of the issues that they used in defense of this, still better eat your carbs and lower your fat, is they were assuming that high fat equals heart attacks. If you eat a high-fat diet, you will get a heart attack, you will get a heart event, you will get a stroke, some kind of a cardiovascular issue. But Gary goes into the idea that the number one factor that indicates you've got a heart attack in your future is the fact that you're diabetic, that you have high glucose. Let me just read a couple of the things he says as they debated back and forth about whether you go high fat or low fat, high carb or low carb, or don't worry about the carbs, just eat natural carbs. Here's what Gary says. Because those with diabetes are more insulin resistant, more hyperinsulinemic, and have poor glycemic control than those without, they suffer heart disease earlier and more severely. Because again, the number one factor, you say, I don't want a heart attack. Don't even talk to me about diabetes until you can talk to me about heart issues. Gary is saying there is a strong likelihood. In fact, it's beyond a likelihood. It's a guarantee. If you wanted a heart attack, you say, I just want a heart attack. I want to go quickly. I want a heart attack. That's what I want. Then the best thing you could do for yourself is eat high carb and have terrible glucose levels. And of course, you'd have hyperinsulinemia as well if you're a type 2. So he goes on to say, by this thinking, the diet that best prevents heart disease is anyone, and particularly so in diabetes, is the diet that does the best job of controlling blood sugar, reversing the insulin resistance, and minimizing circulating levels of insulin. So he's like, if it's true, and it is, my friends, if it's true that diabetics are more likely to have heart attacks than anybody else. Doesn't matter what your race, whether you're black, white, or brown, doesn't matter whether you're old or young, whether you're fat or skinny. Diabetics are more likely than anybody else to have heart attacks and strokes. And if that is true, logic would dictate that the best thing you can do to prevent a heart attack or a stroke is eat in such a way that you get your glucose under control and your insulin levels lower. So, I mean, that's just common sense. So there's been a debate about cholesterol. Cholesterol is the boogeyman. Cholesterol is the bad guy. If you have high cholesterol, you're going to die of a heart attack pretty quick. And yet there are people that have high cholesterol and they live into their 90s or even over 100 in some cases. And there are people with low cholesterol that die of heart attacks in their 40s and 50s. It's not very much a dead-on correspondence between high cholesterol and heart attacks. But it very much is a correspondence between high glucose and high insulin and heart attacks. In other words, if you're diabetic or even pre-diabetic, you've just upped your chances of heart attacks and strokes tremendously. Ergo, the best thing you can do for your heart is to get those glucose levels down. Ergo, the diet that ought to do that should be the one that will bring down glucose, which is a low-carb diet that either A, doesn't worry about the fat, or B, starts deliberately incorporating more fat in your diet so you don't have to eat so many carbs, because you're going to eat one or the other pretty much. It's either fat, protein, or carbs. And if you cut the carbs, you're going to have to eat more fat. There's just no getting around that. But if it's true that the number one person likely to have a heart attack is the diabetic and or the pre-diabetic, then you got to cut the carbs, at least in my humble opinion. All right, let's get on. He talks about Sarah Hallberg's study. This was, I believe, in 2018, called the Verta Health Trial. It wasn't Sarah Hallberg by herself. She was involved with Steve Finney and Jeff Pollock and others, but she was kind of the principal investigator and director of this health study, the Verta Health Trials. And they took 350-some individuals that were working with her clinic in Indiana University, and 262 of them chose to do the low-carb style and the low-carb diet, and they did it for a couple of years. Now, they didn't all follow through, and by the end of the 2 years, they were down to 194. But what they found was 17% had achieved what they called complete remission of diabetes, which means they were below 5.7 or less than 5.7. So they weren't even pre-diabetic. But over half had at least got down to where they weren't diabetic, under 6.5. So the Verta Health Trial, Gary writes, this health trial demonstrated that the degeneration of the diabetic condition could be reversed, even that the disease itself could be put into drug-free remission. Drug-free remission. They achieved this not by drugs, not by insulin, but by eating a low-carb, higher-fat, higher-protein diet, and saw tremendous results. And Gary writes this, Gary Taubes, he says, after a year of intensive counseling to eat a ketogenic diet had resulted in the improvement of 22 of 26 well-established risk factors for heart disease, including, not surprisingly, HDL cholesterol, triglycerides, and blood pressure. 3 of the 26 factors remained unchanged, and only one got worse, which was the LDL cholesterol. And yet, even that, when you take into account the large fluffy particles versus the dense, that wasn't really an issue. So, what Gary is saying is they found that something everybody already knew, which is you lower the carbs, you eat more fat, a little more protein, or maybe a lot of protein, and you stop diabetes in its tracks. You just shut it down. And that's why you've got people, and we hear from them all the time, that were at a 12 A1C or a 10 or a 9, and now they're at a 5.3 or 5.5 or a 4.9 or a 5.0. They didn't just beat diabetes, they thoroughly whipped it. Now, I know some of you are going to complain, well, Dennis, they didn't whip it, they managed it. But when your glucose is down that low, and what it means for the type 2 is your corresponding insulin levels are also lower, you've done yourself a tremendous favor, and you've moved from being high-risk heart issues to low risk. So don't be so fearful of fat, my friend. Be afraid of being diabetic. Be afraid of high glucose and high insulin levels. Don't be afraid of fat or protein. Do you need more information and inspiration about beating diabetes? The very first line of our description is nearly always a link to our hundreds of videos toward that one subject, how to beat diabetes. Click on that link and start watching these videos. You'll be blessed and, I believe, greatly helped.